Itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the rain.
Oh, hey.
Spider
Ah,
out came.
I'm not doing anything. What are you guys doing? That was Pearl Jam's new song. Okay. So here's what we're going to do this week, kiddos. We are going to read chapter 11 of Into the Wild. I'm sure you guys are dying to figure out what's going on with Christopher McCandless. I'm also sure that some of you have already finished the book because you didn't feel like waiting. So, let's read chapter 11. And then we will take a quiz over 9, 10, and 11. I'll send you guys the quiz. Do your best to answer all the questions. Please don't cheat. Well, how am I going to know? But please don't. And that's what we're going to do this week. And then next week, how many chapters is this stinking book? Is this going to take us to the end of the year? It might. Just because, it might not. I wanted to do a research paper with you guys, but I don't want you to do it without like us in the room together so I can show you all kinds of stuff. And so we might do that at the beginning of the year next year. And this book is, including the epilogue, like 19 chapters. Okay, so we're going to read chapter 11 this week. Take a quiz over 8, 9, 10, 11. This looks really cool. It looks like I'm punching you. Looks like I'm punching you. Okay. So, let me shut this off. This new Pearl Jam album. Definitely not Itsy Bitsy Spider. Okay, I'm going to take the camera and I'm going to point it at the book. Yeah, that's Pearl Jam right there. Pearl Jam, not Itsy Bitsy Spider. Anyway, might have to do this in 2 parts because it's a decent sized chapter. Let me see if I'm doing this right. Oh, that's not bad. I wonder why it won't zoom in more. Oh, it's because I got the front facing camera on. Oh, well. I'll just hold the book like this. It's all backwards because it's the front-facing camera. But we'll just read it and go through it real quick. Everything had changed suddenly. The tone, the moral climate. You didn't know what to think, whom to listen to. As if all your life you had been led by the hand like a small child and suddenly you were on your own. You had to learn to walk by yourself. There was no one around, neither family nor people whose judgment you respected. At such time you felt the need of committing yourself to something absolute. Life, or truth, or beauty, of being ruled by it in place of a man-made rules that had been discarded. You needed to surrender at some such ultimate purpose for more fully, more unreservedly than you had ever done in the old familiar peaceful days, in the old life that was now abolished and gone for good. That was Boris Pasternak from Dr. Zhivago. They actually made kind of a crappy movie out of that a long time ago, but the book's good. But this passage was highlighted in one of the books found with McCandless's remains. And he wrote need for purpose above it. So, Samuel Walter McCandless Jr., 56 years old, is a bearded, taciturn man with longest salt and pepper hair, combed straight back from the high forehead. Tall and solidly proportioned. He wears wire-rimmed glasses that give him a professional demeanor. 7 weeks after the body of his son turned up in Alaska, wrapped in a blue sleeping bag that Billy had sewn for Chris from a kit, Walt studies a sailboat scudding beneath the window of his waterfront townhouse. How is it, he wonders aloud as he gazes blankly across the Chesapeake Bay, that a kid with so much compassion could cause his parents so much pain? The McCandless home in Chesapeake Bay, Maryland, is tastefully decorated, spotless, devoid of clutter. Floor-to-ceiling windows take in a hazy panorama of the bay. A big Chevy Suburban and a white Cadillac park out front. A painstakingly restored '69 Corvette sits in the garage. A 30-foot cruising catamaran is moored at the dock. 4 large squares of poster board covered with scores of photos documenting the whole brief span of Chris's life have occupied the dining room table for many days now. Moving deliberately around the display, where'd it go? Billy points out Chris is a toddler astride a hobby horse. Chris is a wrapped 8-year-old in a yellow rain slicker on his first backpacking trip. Chris at his high school commencement. The hardest part, says Walt, pausing over the shot of his son clowning around on a family vacation, his voice cracking almost imperceptibly, is not having him around anymore. I spent a lot of time with Chris perhaps more than any of my other kids. I really liked his company, even though he frustrated us often. Walt is wearing gray sweatpants, racquetball shoes, and satin baseball jacket embroidered with the logo of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Despite the casual attire, he works on an air. Despite the casual attire, he projects an air of authority. Within the ranks of his arcane field, an advanced technology called a synthetic aperture radar, or SAR, he is an eminence. SAR has been a component of a high-profile space mission since 1978, when the first SAR-equipped satellite, CSAT, was placed into orbit around the Earth. NASA's project manager for the pioneering CSAT launch was Walt McCandless. That guy was really important at NASA. The first line of Walt's resume reads, "Clearance, current U.S. Department of Defense, top secret." A little farther down the page, an account of his professional experience begins. "I perform private consulting services aligned with remote sensor and satellite system design and associated signal processing, data reduction, and information extraction tasks. Colleagues refer to him as brilliant." Walt is accustomed to calling his shots. Taking control is something he does unconsciously, reflexively. Although he speaks softly in an unhurried cadence of the American West, his voice has an edge, and the set of his jaw betrays an undercurrent of nervous energy. Even across the room, it is apparent that some high voltage is crackling through his wires. There is no mistaking whence Chris's intensity came. When Walt talks, people listen. If something or someone displeases him, his eyes narrow and his speech becomes clipped. According to members of the extended family, his moods can be dark and Mercurial. I don't know that word. Mercurial. I can't ask my phone. Let's ask the computer. I'll be right back. I'll let it play so you guys can hear it.
Mercurial.
Mercurial. Let me try that again.
Mercurial.
That's still, I can't hardly say it.
Mercurial.
I wonder what it means. Mercurial. Ooh, I got it now. Mercurial. And what does it mean? Unpredictable change. So he's subject to unpredictable change. That's kind of cool. Okay. Although they say his famous temper has lost much of its validity in recent years. After Chris gave everybody the slip in 1990, something changed in Walt. His son's disappearance scared and chastened him. A softer, more tolerant side of his personality came to the fore. So his dad starts becoming softer, more understanding of things, less I must control everything all the time kind of guy. Walt grew up in poor Greeley, Colorado, an agricultural town on the high, windswept plains near the Wyoming line. His family, he declares matter-of-factly, was from the wrong side of the tracks. A bright child and driven, he won an academic scholarship to Colorado State University in nearby Fort Collins. To make ends meet, bell's ringing. To make ends meet, he held down an assortment of part-time jobs through college, including one in a mortuary. His steadiest paycheck came from playing with Charlie Novak, a leader from the popular jazz quartet. Novak's band, with Walt sitting in on the piano, worked the regional lounge circuit, covering dance numbers and old standards in smoky honky-tonks up and down the Fort Range. An inspired musician with considerable natural talent, Walt still plays professionally from time to time. So now we know where Chris got all of his aptitude for music. Better take a drink while I'm waiting. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, casting a shadow of fear across America. In the ensuing national hysteria, and it was a lot of fear, because this Sputnik went up in the late 50s, or mid-50s, I believe. But that's when that was basically the start of the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And everybody feared that the Soviet Union might weaponize space. So we were like, oh, we got to beat them to it. And then when John Kennedy was elected, he was like, listen, before the end of this decade, we're going to the moon. Which he said in 1961 or 2. And he was like, within 8 years, we're going to build a spaceship that will take us to the moon and land on the moon. Which is astonishing considering, 20 years earlier, prop planes were still flying in World War II. But anyway, that's another story. In the ensuing national hysteria, Congress funneled millions upon millions of dollars into California-based aerospace industry, and the boom was on. For young Walt McCandless, just out of college, married and with a baby on the way, Sputnik opened the door to opportunity. After receiving his undergraduate diploma, Walt took a job at Hughes Aircraft. You guys know who owns Hughes Aircraft? You ever heard of the Spruce Goose? Or that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? I can't think of the guy's name now. He ended up being a recluse. What was his name? Howard Hughes. I couldn't think of Howard Hughes. I would definitely check out that Leonardo DiCaprio movie, though. It is super, super good. And really gives you a glimpse into the tortured mind of Howard Hughes. Oh, what's the name of that movie? It's The Aviator. The Aviator. Really good movie. But anyway, back to this. You guys know how I like to stop and talk about stuff. Belle, take a drink. Okay. Which sent him to Tucson for 3 years, where he earned a master's degree in antenna theory at the University of Arizona. As soon as he completed this thesis and analytical of conical helices, he transferred to Hughes' big California operation, where the real action was. Eager to make his mark in the race for space, he bought a little bungalow in Torrance, worked hard, moved up the ladder quickly. Sam was born in 1959, and 4 children, Stacy, Shauna, Shelley, and Shannon, followed in quick succession. Walt was appointed test director and section head for the Surveyor 1 mission, the first spacecraft to make a soft landing on the moon. His star was bright and rising. By 1965, however, his marriage was in trouble. He and his wife, Marcia, separated. Walt started dating the secretary at Hughes named Wilhelmina, that girl's voice or name, Wilhelmina Johnson. Everyone called her Billy. It's Chris's mom. He was 22 years old and had dark, striking eyes. They fell in love and moved in together, and Billy got pregnant. Very petite to begin with, in 9 months she gained only 8 pounds and never even wore maternity clothes. On February 12, 1968, Billy gave birth to a son. He was underweight but healthy and animated. Walt bought Billy a Gianni guitar on which she strummed lullabies to soothe the fussy newborn. 22 years later, rangers from the National Park Service would find that same guitar in the back seat of a yellow Datsun abandoned near the shore of Lake Mead. It's impossible to know what murky convergence of chromosomal matter, parent-child dynamics, and the alignment of the cosmos was responsible, but Christopher Johnson McCandless came into the world with unusual gifts and will not easily be deflected from his trajectory. Ugh, I can't read today. At the age of 2, he got up in the middle of the night, found his way outside without waking his parents, and entered the house down the street to plunder the neighbor's candy drawer. So he was, 2 years old, and he broke out of the house to go steal candy from the neighbor's house? In the 3rd grade, just trying to see the time. In the 3rd grade, after receiving a high score on standardized achievement test, Chris was placed in an accelerated program for gifted students. He wasn't happy about it, Billy remembers, because they meant that he had to do extra schoolwork. So he spent his week trying to get himself out of the program. This little boy had attempted to convince the teacher, the principal, and anyone who would listen that the test results were in error, that he didn't really belong there. We learned about this at the first PTA meeting. His teacher pulled us aside and told us that Chris marches to a different drummer, and she just shook her head. Even when we were little, says Corrine, his sister, he was born 3 years after Chris, he was very to himself. He wasn't antisocial. He always had friends and everybody liked him, but he could go off and entertain himself for hours. He didn't seem to need toys or friends. He could be alone without being lonely. When Chris was 6, Walt was offered a position at NASA, prompting a move to the nation's capital. They bought a split-level house on Willett Drive in suburban Annandale. It had green shutters, a bay window, and a nice yard. 4 years after arriving in Virginia, Walt quit working at NASA to start a consulting firm, User Systems Incorporated, which he and Billy ran out of their home. Money was tight. In addition to the financial strain of exchanging a steady paycheck for the vagaries of self-employment, Walt's separation from his first wife had left him with 2 families to support. To make a go of it, says Corrine, Mom and Dad put in incredibly long hours. When Chris and I woke up in the morning to go to school, they'd be in the office working. When we came home in the afternoon, they'd be in the office working. When we went to bed at night, they'd be in the office working. They ran a real good business together and eventually started making bunches of money, but they worked all the time. It was a stressful existence. Both Walt and Billy are tightly wound, emotional, and loath to give ground. Now and then tension erupted in verbal sparring. In moments of anger, one or the other often threatened divorce. The rancor was more smoke than fire, says Corrine, but I think it was one of the reasons Chris and I were so close. We learned to count on each other when Mom and Dad weren't getting along. But there were good times, too. On weekends and when school was out, the family took to the road. They drove to Virginia Beach and on the Carolina shore, to Colorado to visit Walt's kids from his first marriage, to the Great Lakes, and to Blue Ridge Mountains. We camped out of the back of the truck, the Chevy Suburban, Walt explains. Later, we bought an Airstream trailer and traveled with that. Chris loved those trips. The longer, the better. There was always a little wanderlust in the family, and it was clear early on that Chris inherited it. In the course of the travels, the family visited Iron Mountain, Michigan, a small mining town in the forests of the Upper Peninsula that was Billy's childhood home. She was one of 6 kids. Lauren Johnson, Billy's father, ostensibly worked as a truck driver, but he never held any job for very long, she said. Billy's dad didn't quite fit into society, Walt explains. In many ways, he and Chris were a lot alike. Lauren Johnson was proud and stubborn and dreamy. A woodsman, a self-taught musician, a writer of poetry. Around Iron Mountain, his rapport with the creatures of the forest was legendary. He was always raising wildlife, says Billy. He'd find some animal in a trap, take it home, amputated the injured limb, let it heal, and then let it go again. Once my dad hit a mother deer with his truck, making an orphan of its fawn. He was crushed, but he brought the baby deer home and raised it inside the house, behind the wood stove, just like it was one of the kids. To support his family, Lauren tried a series of entrepreneurial ventures. None of them seemed very successful. He raised chickens for a while, then mink and chinchillas. He opened a stable and sold horse rides to tourists. Much of the food he put on the table came from hunting, despite the fact that he was uncomfortable with killing animals. My dad cried every time he shot a deer, Billy says, but we had to eat, so he did it. He also worked as a hunting guide, which pained him even more. Men from the city would drive up in their big Cadillacs, and my dad would take them out to his hunting camp for a week to get a trophy. He would guarantee them a buck before they left, but most of them were such lousy shots and drank so much that they couldn't hit anything, so he'd usually have to shoot the deer for them. God, he hated that. Lauren, not surprisingly, was charmed by Chris, and Chris adored his grandfather. The old man's backwoods savvy was his affinity for the wilderness and left a deep impression on the boy. When Chris was 8, Walt took him on his first overnight backpacking trip, a 3-day hike in the Shenandoah to climb Old Rag. They made the summit, and Chris carried his own backpack the whole way. Hiking up the mountain became a father and son tradition. They climbed Old Rag almost every year thereafter. When Chris was a little older, Walt took Billy and his children from both marriages to climb Long Peak in Colorado at 14,256 feet, the highest summit in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Walt, Chris, and Walt's youngest son from his first marriage reached the 13,000-foot elevation. There, at a prominent notch called Keyhole, Walt decided to turn around. He was tired and feeling the altitude. The route above looked slabby, exposed, dangerous. I'd had it okay, Walt explains, but Chris wanted to keep going to the top. I told him no way. He was 12 then, so all he could do was complain. If he had been 14 or 15, he would have simply gone on without me. Walt grows quiet, staring absently into the distance. Chris was fearless, even when he was little, he says after a long pause. He didn't think the odds applied to him. We were trying to pull him back from the edge. Chris was a high achiever in almost everything that caught his fancy. Academically, he brought home A's with little effort. Only once did he ever receive a grade lower than a B, an F, in high school physics. Ooh, physics, you guys like this class, don't you? When he saw the report card, Walt made an appointment with the physics teacher to see what the problem was. He was a retired Air Force. Let me try it again. He was a retired Air Force colonel, Walt remembers. An old guy, traditional, pretty rigid. He explained at the beginning of the semester that because he had something like 200 students, lab reports had to be written in a particular format to make grading them more manageable proposition. Chris thought it was a stupid rule and decided to ignore it. He did his lab reports, but not in the correct format, so the teacher gave him an F. After talking to the guy, I came home and told Chris he got the grade he deserved. Yeah, we'll just make this a long video. We'll read the whole thing. What do we care? Both Chris and Corinne shared Walt's musical aptitude. Chris took up guitar, piano, and French horn. It was strange to see a kid at his age, says Walt, but he loved Tony Bennett. He'd sing numbers like Tender is the Night while I accompanied him on piano. It was good. Indeed, in a goofy video Chris made in college, he could be heard belting out Summers by the Sea, Sailboats, and Capri with impressive panache, crooning like a professional lounge singer. A gifted horn player as a teen, he was a member of the American University Symphony, but quit, according to Walt, after objecting to the rules imposed by a high school band leader. Corinne recalls that there was more to it than that. He quit playing partly because he didn't like being told what to do, also because of me. I wanted to be like Chris, so I started playing French horn too, and it turned out to be the one thing I was better at than he was. When I was a freshman and he was a senior, I made first chair in the senior band, and there was no way he was going to sit behind his damn sister. Their musical rivalry seems to not have damaged the relationship between Chris and Corinne, however. They had been best friends from an early age, spending hours together building forts out of cushions and blankets in their Annandale living room. He was always really nice to me, Corinne says, and extremely protective. He'd hold my hand when we walked down the street. When he was in junior high and I was still in grade school, he got out earlier than me. But then he'd hang out at his friend Brian Patowski's house so we can walk home together. Chris inherited Billy's angelic features, most notably her eyes, the black depths of which portrayed his every emotion. Although he was small, in school photographs he was always in the front row, the shortest kid in class. Chris was strong for his size and well coordinated. He tried his hand at many sports but had little patience for learning the finer points of any of them. And when he went skiing during our family vacations in Colorado, he seldom bothered to turn. He simply crouched in a gorilla tuck, feet spread wide for stability, and point the boards straight down the hill. Likewise, says Walt, when I tried to teach him to play golf, he refused to accept that form is everything. Chris would take the biggest swing you ever saw, every time. Sometimes he'd hit the ball 300 yards, but more often he'd slice it into the next fairway. Chris had so much natural talent, Walt continues, but if you tried coaching him to polish his skills, to bring out that final 10%, a wall went up. He resisted instruction of any kind. I'm a serious racquetball player, and I taught Chris to play when he was 11. By that time, he was 15 or 16. By the time he was 15 or 16, he was beating me regularly. He was very, very quick and had a lot of power. When I suggested he work on the gaps in his game, he refused to listen. Once in a tournament, he came up against a 45-year-old man with a lot of experience. Chris won a bunch of points right out of the gate, but the guy was methodically testing him, probing for his weakness. As soon as he figured out which shot gave Chris the most trouble, that was the only shot Chris saw, and it was all over. Nuance, strategy, and anything beyond the rudimentaries of technique were wasted on Chris. The only way he cared to tackle a challenge was head on, right now, applying the full brunt of his extraordinary energy. And he was often frustrated as a consequence. It wasn't until he took up running, an activity that rewards will and determination more than finesse and cunning, that he found his athletic calling. At the age of 10, he entered his first running competition, a 10-kilometer road race. He finished 69th, beating more than 1,000 adults, and was hooked. By the time he was in his teens, he was one of the top distance runners in the region. When Chris was 12, Walt and Billy bought Corrine a puppy, a Shetland sheepdog named Buckley, and Chris fell into the habit of taking the pet with him on his daily training runs. Buckley was supposed to be my dog, says Corrine, but he and Chris became inseparable. Buckley was fast, and he'd always meet Chris home when they were running. And I remember Chris was so excited the first time he made it home before Buckley. He went tearing all through the house yelling, "I beat Buck! I beat Buck!" At W.T. Woodson High School, a large public institution in Fairfax, Virginia, with a reputation for high academic standards and winning athletic teams, Chris was the captain of the cross-country squad. Where'd it go? He relished the role and concocted novel, grueling training regimens that his teammates still remember well. He was really pushing himself, explains Gordy Kukulu. That's a weird name. A younger member of the team. Chris invented this workout he called Road Warriors. He would lead us on long, killer runs through places like farmers' fields and construction sites, places we weren't supposed to be, and intentionally try to get us lost. We'd run as far and as fast as we could down strange roads, through the woods, whatever. The whole idea was to lose our bearings, to push ourselves into unknown territory. And then we'd run at slightly slower pace until we found a road we recognized and race home again at full speed. In a certain sense, that's how Chris lived his entire life. McCandless viewed running as an intensely spiritual exercise, verging on religion. Chris would use the spiritual aspects to try to motivate us, recalls Eric Hathaway, another friend on the team. He'd tell us to think about all the evil in the world, all the hatred, imagine ourselves running against the forces of darkness, the evil wall that was trying to keep us from running our best. He believed doing well was all mental, a simple matter of harnessing whatever energy was available. And impressionable high school kids, we were blown away by this kind of talk. Running wasn't exclusively an affair of the spirit. It was a competitive undertaking as well. When McCandless ran, he ran to win. McCandless was really serious about running, says Chris Maxie Gilmer, a female teammate who was perhaps McCandless's closest friend at Woodson. I can remember standing at the finish line, watching him run, knowing how badly he wanted to do well and how disappointed he'd be if he did worse than expected. After a bad race or even a bad time trial during practice, he could be really hard on himself, and he wouldn't want to talk about it. If I tried to console him, he'd act annoyed and brush me off. He internalized the disappointment. He'd go off alone somewhere and beat himself up. It wasn't just running that Chris took seriously, Gilmer adds. He was like that about everything. You aren't supposed to think about heavy-duty stuff in high school, but I did and he did too, which was why we hit it off. We'd hang out during snack break at his locker and talk about life, the state of the world, serious things. I'm black and I could never figure out why everyone made such a big deal about race. Chris would talk to me about that kind of thing. He understood. He was always questioning stuff in the same way. I liked him a lot. He was a really good guy. McCandless took life's inequities to heart. During his senior year at Woodson, he became obsessed with racial oppression in South Africa. We've talked about that before, the apartheid. Has my face been in this thing the whole time? Crap. Yeah, it is. Oh, well. Where'd he go? Oh. He spoke seriously to his friends about smuggling weapons into the country and joining the struggle to end the apartheid. We get into arguments about it every once in a while, recalls Hathaway. Chris didn't like going through channels, working within the system, waiting his turn. He'd say, come on, Eric, we can raise enough money to go South Africa on our own. Right now, it's just a matter of deciding to do it. I'd counter by saying we were only a couple of kids, that we couldn't possibly make a difference. But you couldn't argue with him. He'd come back with something like, oh, I guess so, you just don't care about right and wrong. On weekends, when his high school pals were attending kegers and trying to sneak into Georgetown bars, McCandless would wander the seedier quarters of Washington, chatting with prostitutes and homeless people, buying them meals, earnestly suggesting they might improve their lives. Chris didn't understand how people could possibly be allowed to go hungry, especially in this country, says Billy. He would rave about that kind of thing for hours. On one occasion, Chris picked up a homeless man from the street to D.C., brought him home to leafy, affluent Annandale, and secretly set the guy up in the Airstream trailer his parents had parked beside the garage. Walt and Billy never knew they were hosting a vagrant. On another occasion, Chris drove over to Hathaway's house and announced they were going downtown. Cool, Hathaway remembers thinking. It was Friday night, and I assumed that we were headed to a Georgetown party. Instead, Chris parked down on 14th Street, which at the time was a really bad part of town. And then he said, you know, Eric, you could read about this stuff, but you can't understand it until you live it. Tonight, that's what we're going to do. We spent the next few hours hanging out in creepy places, talking to pimps and hookers and lowlifes. I was like, scared. Towards the end of the evening, Chris asked me how much money I had. I said $5. He had 10. Okay, you buy gas, he told me. I'm going to go get some food. He spent the $10 on a big bag of hamburgers, and we drove around handing them out to smelly guys sleeping on grates. It was the weirdest Friday night of my life. But Chris did that kind of thing a lot. Early in his senior year at Woodson, Chris informed his parents that he had no intention of going to college. When Walt and Billy suggested that he needed a college degree to attain a fulfilling career, Chris answered that careers were demeaning, 20th century inventions, more of a liability than an asset, and he would do fine without one, thank you. That put us in kind of a tizzy, Walt admits. Both Billy and I come from blue-collar families. A college degree is something we don't take lightly, okay? And we worked hard to be able to afford to send our kids to good schools. So Billy sat him down and said, Chris, if you really want to make a difference in the world, you really want to help people who are less fortunate, get yourself some leverage first. Go to college, get a law degree, and then you'll be able to make a real impact. Chris brought home good grades, says Hathaway. He didn't get into trouble. He was a high achiever. He did what he was supposed to do. His parents didn't really have grounds to complain, but they got on his case about going to college, and whatever they said to him, it must have worked, because he ended up going to Emory, even though he thought it was pointless and a waste of time and money. It's somewhat surprising that Chris seceded to the pressure from Walt and Billy about attending college when he refused to listen to them about so many other things. But there was never a shortage of apparent contradictions in the relationship between Chris and his parents. When Chris visited Chris Gilmer, he frequently railed against Billy and Walt, portraying them as unreasonable tyrants. Yet to his male buddies, Hathaway, Kukalu, and other track star Andy Horowitz, he scarcely complained at all. My impression was that his parents were very nice people, says Hathaway. No different, really, than my parents or anyone's parents. Chris just didn't like being told what to do. I think he would have been unhappy with any parents. He had trouble with the whole idea of parents. McCandless's personality was puzzling in its complexity. He was intensely private. He could be convivial and gregarious in the extreme. And despite his overdeveloped social conscience, he was no tight-lipped, perpetually grim do-gooder who frowned on fun. To the contrary, he enjoyed tipping a glass now and then, and was an incorrigible ham. Perhaps the greatest paradox concerned his feelings about money. Walt and Billy had both known poverty when they were young, and after struggling to rise above it, saw nothing wrong with enjoying the fruits of their labor. We worked very, very hard, Billy emphasizes. We did without when the kids were little, saved what we earned, and invested in our future. When the future finally arrived, they didn't flaunt their modest wealth, but they bought nice clothes, some jewelry for Billy, a Cadillac. Eventually, they purchased a townhouse on the bay and the sailboat. They took the kids to Europe, skiing in Breckenridge, a Caribbean cruise, and Chris, Billy acknowledges, was embarrassed by all of that. Her son, the teenage Tolstoyan, believed that wealth was shameful, corrupting, and inherently evil, which is ironic because Chris was a natural-born capitalist with an uncanny knack for making a buck. Chris was always an entrepreneur, Billy says with a laugh. Always. As an 8-year-old, he grew vegetables behind the house in Annandale and sold them door to door around the neighborhood. Here was this cute little boy pulling a wagon full of fresh-grown beans and tomatoes and peppers, says Green. Who could resist? And Chris knew it. He knew that he'd have this look on his face like, I'm damn cute, want to buy some beans? By the time he came home, the wagon would be empty, and he'd have a bunch of money in his hand. When Chris was 12, he printed up a stack of flyers and started a neighborhood copy business. Chris's Fast Copies, offering free pickup and delivery. Using the copier in Walt and Billy's office, he paid his parents a few cents a copy, charged customers 2 cents less than the corner store charged, and made a tidy profit. In 1985, following his junior year at Woodson, Chris was hired by a local building contractor to canvass neighborhoods for sales, drumming up siding jobs and kitchen remodelings. And he was astonishingly successful, a salesman without peer. In a matter of a few months, half a dozen other students were working under him, and he put $7,000 into his bank account. He used part of that money to buy the yellow Datsun, the second-hand B210. Chris had such an outstanding knack for selling that in the spring of 1986, as Chris's high school graduation approached, the owner of the construction company phoned Walt and offered to pay for Chris's college education if Walt would persuade his son to remain in Annandale and keep working while he was in school instead of quitting the job and going off to Emory. When I mentioned the offer to Chris, says Walt, he wouldn't even consider it. He told his boss that he had other plans. As soon as high school was over, Chris declared, he was going to get behind the wheel of his new car and spend the summer driving across the country. Nobody anticipated that the journey would be the first in a series of extended transcontinental adventures. Nor could anyone in his family have foreseen that a chance discovery during the initial journey would ultimately turn him inward and away, drawing Chris and those who loved him into the morass of anger, misunderstanding, and sorrow. All right, guys. So that was chapter 11. So now that chapter 11 is over, I'm going to send you a quiz for 9, 10, and 11. Do me a favor. Try not to cheat. And then try to send me that quiz by Friday afternoon if you could. Okay. Have a good week, guys. Stay safe. Macaulay out.